So segueing into doing some more like direct consulting around HR practices over the years. That said, I am not certified. I am not an HR professional, and I am definitely not an employment lawyer. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that like what you're getting today is just like, here's what it looks like on the ground. And here's practices that I've been able to implement as somebody who has helped organizations and also led organizations for a lot of years. This is also the first time that I've tried pulling together all of my disparate thoughts on this topic. So I'd love some feedback at the end of this about like, was this a good way to get into the conversation? Were there things missing? All that kind of stuff. And I also don't know, I didn't time it out for like how long the me talking part of this is going to be at the beginning. So I think it's probably going to be about 50-50 with like time to talk at the end. But again, since this is new material, I also really welcome people to just pop in with questions here and there. If there's something that I'm talking about that you're like, wait, I want to talk about that right now. Totally happy to do that. You can use the reaction thing to put your hand up. You can also drop questions into the chat. And Andrew, if you're willing to just kind of keep an eye on that for me and make sure I'm not missing anybody, because when I'm in screen share mode, I won't be able to see that. Yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to hop into screen sharing and get us into the topic. Oh, and also I'm like super grateful that like OCFSN was willing to let me do this. This was very helpful for me to try to pull my thoughts together on this. And I love sharing information. And I found myself after a couple calls where I showed up and was like very sort of fierce about HR related stuff. I started getting messages from other EDs around the state saying like, hey, can you share that doc with me? And like, can you talk that through with me? And then I realized that it would be easier to just share it with everybody who wants to hear it at once, rather than me continuing to have long 2-hour conversations individually. I'm like, let's just talk about it. So that's how we got here. So we're going to talk about wages, benefits, and hiring, and a smidge at the end about like evaluations and that kind of stuff, which is part of the HR package as well. So, the other thing I should say is that because I've mostly worked in the nonprofit sector, I may be putting things in terms of nonprofits, and I know some of you are not nonprofits, so feel free to like ask me to pause and like translate that if it doesn't make sense for your context. But I'm actually going to start out with just a stat on the nonprofit sector. So it turns out that about half of the resignations from the nonprofit sector are directly related to compensation and benefits. And these stats were taken the last time that they were fully pulled together by nonprofithr.com, was before the Great Resignation. And so I think some of these stats probably are a little bit out of date, but it was pretty interesting looking at this. And we sort of, I feel like in the nonprofit sector, we all sort of know this, that our people are definitely underpaid and overworked. But actually seeing some stats on it was helpful for me to ground, like, is this really that? It's like, no, actually, this is really that important for us to be talking about. So I want to ask a question sort of at the beginning here, to also get some other voices in the room right at the beginning. So when you think about like how we generally set wages, like how are wages typically set? What goes into that? Just gonna open it up for sharing. Yeah, and feel free to just unmute and pop in.
Trying to make them as competitive as possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What else is typical for wage setting?
Our organization used a metric that was, I think it's called the housing living wage. And I think it was Oregon Tenant Rights Association. I can't quite remember.
That's great. Do you think that's typical that organizations?
No, I don't think that's typical. We were trying to be progressive, and now I'm sure that number has gone up quite a bit. So that's what we're struggling with right now, is what was a progressive wage for us is now just baseline, and yeah, I don't know if we can afford to like actually go up to that next level of like, what is a housing living wage now? So it's interesting. Conundrum.
Great. All right. What else do you think typically goes into it?
Looking at other jobs of similar roles and comparing wages that way.
Great. All right. Anything else folks want to offer?
There's a lot of good ones in the chat too, Yana.
Oh, okay. Can you read those off for me, Andrew?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've got competitive market rates, years of experience, education, intensive job comparison research, living wage standards. Kind of got that. Wages across sectors and regions. Level of job responsibilities. Trying to make market competitive tiers based on job responsibility level with bumps for language skills, extensive related experience, education, etc.
Okay, great.
There's a couple more, but
okay, are they similar?
NAO compensation and benefits report.
Which I believe was too cheap to pay for.
Right, because it's a really expensive report to pay for to get that data, right? Yeah.
Program history.
Program history. Ooh, can whoever said that one say a little bit more?
Yeah, this is Emily. I was just saying that I think that oftentimes it's just that that's what the wages have always been, and nobody's actually giving any consideration to what they should be or why they were set at that level originally.
Okay, great. Thanks, Emily. Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. And I think that some of you are putting things on here that that are becoming more common, but are not necessarily what I would call typical. I would say that the other typical thing is how much can we get away with not paying people? I mean, that is absolutely part of what is typical. And you see that, you absolutely see that like in the for-profit sector, you think about like food service and all that kind of stuff, how much businesses need to get really pushed on. But you also see that happen in the nonprofit sector where we tend to be, budgets tend to be really tight, funding tends to be really hard to find, all that kind of stuff. And so there's, I'm going to add what we can get away with to this, because I think that's actually, we don't like saying that or thinking about it, but I think for a lot of us that ends up being like when we're looking at our budget development for the next year, sometimes that is a really big factor that comes into play for us. Yeah, okay, great. So I'm gonna pop this back into slideshow mode. One of the things that's interesting to look at this list, and particularly the one that I added to this, and the wages across sectors and regions, which can often end up kind of dumbing down what we're paying, because if I just look at what other nonprofits in the area pay, I would be paying a lot less than I'm paying right now, because typically wages are really low in at least this part of the sector. And a lot of this ends up centering the organization's needs rather than the workers' needs. We pay what the organization needs to pay in order to get applicants to come in. Sometimes we get no applicants, and so we bump it up by $1 or $2 and try to get some other applicants through the door. So that's a really common thing that ends up happening. So I'm going to challenge us today to think about who we are centering in all of our HR stuff. So HR departments, if you're in an organization that's big enough to actually have one of those, which I've never worked for an organization that was, but there's a reason why HR departments have a kind of shitty reputation among workers, because they are often about covering the ass of the organization rather than centering what actual worker needs are. And so I'm going to challenge us to do a little thought experiment here for a second and think about things from if we were to center the worker in our thinking, how different would it be rather than centering what the organization is getting? What is it that our workers are giving us? Oh, I just saw somebody take a picture. I'm going to give you these slides so you don't have to worry about writing it down if it's on the slides. So yeah, sorry, I was going to say that at the beginning and I didn't. So for instance, when we think about from the worker's perspective, so I'm the executive director of the organization. When I give an hour of my time to the organization, that's an hour that I am not spending hanging out with my dog or my partner or writing or doing art or sitting on the beach or resting or doing any of the other things that I could be doing that I really value in my life. I'm giving my organization that hour instead of doing all those other things. And you know what? Our market assistant, that is exactly the same for them. They are giving up an hour of their life in the same way that I am giving up an hour of my life. And it doesn't matter that they're the market assistant and I'm the executive director in terms of our experience of what it's like to give an hour of our time to the organization, that is identical. And we often don't think of it in those terms. And it's how we end up with very big wage gaps between people because we don't start with that as the consideration for our wages. We start with a whole bunch of other stuff, education level, responsibility, all that kind of stuff that I'm going to say is not unimportant, but it is centering what the organization is getting rather than what the worker is giving. And I'm going to encourage us to flip that on its head as we're thinking about this stuff today. So if we were centering workers, this is a package that has sort of emerged for me over the years that adds up to actually centering the worker and not what the business or organization gets from them. So one of them that a bunch of you have already talked about, starting with living wages in your area. So we're trying to make efforts. That's become a catchphrase in the last few years. I'll follow this link in a second so you can see where it goes if you're not familiar with how to figure out what a living wage is in your area. I'm going to give you a resource for that. The second thing, and the thing that is probably the most radical that I'm going to talk about today, is employing a wage ratio in your organization. I'll explain in detail what I mean by that. And then using a carefully crafted and applied wage setting matrix. I'll also explain what that is. I'll share with you a blank of the one that I've been using with clients in the organizations that I've worked for. And then making salaries and raises non-negotiable and raises automatic and tied to cost of living. There's a bunch of equity issues embedded in leaving negotiation open and or making people negotiate for raises and for what their salaries are. Basically, the statistics will tell you that when you make things negotiable, white men make a lot more money than anybody else because they're really good at talking themselves up compared to basically anyone else. So there's a fundamental security that comes with the privilege of being, a cis het white man. And that absolutely shows up in the stats on wage discrepancies. So when you make that stuff non-negotiable and everybody is treated the same way, that is one of the most important leverage points that we can have for actually leading to long-term equity within our organizations. The next one is practicing pay transparency, and I'm not going to talk about this anywhere else, so I'll say a little bit about this one. So it's actually illegal in Oregon to stop people from talking about their wages with each other. So you can't prevent people from doing that. And the reason for that is that scenario that I was talking about a few minutes ago with one of my clients, where you can end up with big discrepancies that are usually race and gender. They track really well along race and gender lines. And also just like how assertive somebody is, like there's a particular personality that is going to push for and advocate for themselves. It's not only about race and gender, but it tracks pretty well along those lines. And so one of the things that we do, like my staff right now, is starting to work on our budget for next year. And I have given everybody on staff access to the entire spreadsheet, including the tab that shows everybody's salary. So everybody on staff knows exactly what everybody else is making. I don't make people get up the nerve to ask their fellow employees how much each other are making, because that puts a lot of pressure on them to be able to even get information to know whether they should be advocating for themselves or not. So practicing pay transparency is a really good practice overall. And finally, always pay people for all their hours worked. This is another place where the nonprofit sector is terrible. We will say it's a 40-hour-a-week job, and we will let our EDs and our development people and our programs people work 60, 70, 80 hours a week and not compensate them for that because they are salaried positions. Terrible, terrible practice. And, what I would say is, have people track their hours closely enough that if they're going over hours, that you either flex it the next week. If it's a 35-hour position and they work 40 hours a week, encourage them to work 30 hours a week the next week and track it and report it back to you. If people are consistently working over the hours that the job was posted at, you either need to hire somebody else or you need to change how they're being compensated so that it actually accurately reflects how many hours that they're putting in. So this is just a basic, it's called wage theft, actually, which is the most common form of theft in the United States. Like billions of dollars every year are stolen from workers because we are just not paying them for the hours that they're working. And again, this is life energy that we're talking about. This is that hour or those 10 hours that they are not spending, with their cat or on the beach or sleeping or whatever it is that they want to be doing. So we are taking that away from them and not compensating them for it. Okay, I'm going to go into detail about the first 4 points, but does anybody have questions about just why these 6 things, or want to say anything at this point? Should I go into details? Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so what is a wage ratio and why have one? So what a wage ratio says is that there is some amount over which the top paid person in the organization can't be paid in comparison to the bottom paid person. So for instance, a 2-to-1 ratio would be somebody's making $20 an hour, somebody's making $40 an hour, and that's the full range within the organization or the business. So current US average CEO to worker pay ratio is 399-to-1. That means if someone working for the company is making $10 an hour, the CEO, the boss, is making $3,990 per hour compared to them. That's massive. Nonprofit sector is a lot better, but you often have like a 10-to-1 ratio in organizations. That's not unusual for larger nonprofits. Even in small organizations, somebody could be making 3 to 4 times what that person is. And again, that is centering what the organization is getting, not what everybody within the organization is giving. One of the things that is really bad about this is that it means that we're doing something within our organization that is actually contributing to the problems that the entire nonprofit sector exists to address. So when we're talking about, if you are part of, we're all in food systems work here. So, people not being able to afford food, part of that is a problem that we contribute to when we have massive wage discrepancies within our organizations. Okay, so what's the right wage ratio? There isn't really a solid answer to this. I've worked with groups that are at 3-to-1. Our organization, I've been using 1.5-to-1. So that means that I can't be making more than 50% more than anybody within the organization. Ratios are typically applied to starting wages. And so if in 5 years I've been with the organization for 6 years and I've gotten raises, I might actually be making a little bit more than 50% from somebody who's a new hire coming in at one of the lower paid places in the organization. So you can also have an optional second ratio for absolute ratios after wages, but mostly it's easiest to just have it be applied to starting wages within the organization. Okay, so let me back up here for a second and show you these things. Okay, so I'm suggesting starting with living wages in your area. So this link will take you to, this is the most common one and the sort of best researched and documented one this is the MIT website. And you can go in here, you can find Oregon. I'm going to click our county, Clatsop County, and it will tell you what a living wage is for your county with people in different scenarios. And they also go through like typical expenses down here. So they show you their work for where, how they actually got to the conclusions that they got to. And so if you look across here, so living wage, you know, with one adult with 0 children is about $17 an hour. So you can make it with that amount of money in our county. And if you are 2 adults and only one of them is working, it jumps up to 28. If you've got kids involved, if you look here, so 1 adult with 3 children, living wage is about $61 an hour. So I don't know anybody in the food systems network who is doing $61 an hour as their minimum wage. So we have we've got a lot of space to grow and to get better about this. But this is where you would find that information if you want to be able to use that thing that somebody was talking about at the beginning about like, how do we take into account not just housing, but everything, cost of food, all that kind of stuff. This gets updated semi-regularly. It's a really big database though, so they have a lot of work to do to keep it up because this has got every county in the United States listed in it. So that is that resource and how you even find out what a living wage would be in your area. So then I'm suggesting using a wage setting matrix. And this is what I mean. So this is our wage setting matrix that I've been using in North Coast Food Web. And you're going to get, this one is a blank actually, that has sort of examples. Let me actually get over to ours so I can show you what we are up to. Yeah, so this is the North Coast Food Web one that I currently use to set wages. And essentially how this document is set up is that there's a whole bunch of organization specific and appropriate criteria that are going into how we think about jobs. And so in this case, we've got a whole bunch of them, and it's everything from relational skills, you know, how much you're public facing, how much you're convening things, how much relationship management and maintenance is needed for the role. All that relational stuff, food systems knowledge needed. There's some roles in the organization where you need that, and there's some roles where you don't. There's entrepreneurial energy. There's how much experience is actually needed to do this job well. So for each of these, I've gone through and I've articulated what a 1 through 4 scale would be on each of these things, where 1 is kind of the entry level. Like if a job was entirely scoring 1s on this, that would be truly an entry level position where somebody could come in without any kind of, you know, you don't need a college degree, you don't need prior work experience. You can just pop right in and start your work career right there. A 4, if something was scoring entirely 4s, and like this is a theoretical job in both cases. I mean, there's hardly any jobs that are either entirely 1s or entirely 4s. That would be something that like you need somebody with really deep prior and specific experience with a lot of different skills and willingness to both deal with tech and humans, for instance. So then the second tab on this has job calculations. And so I then go through, and for every job within the organization, there's been a number run for this, where I go through and I ask each one of those questions about the job. And then over here at the tail end of the second tab, there's a calculation. And so it's generating an average number, an average score, and then it gets put through this that takes into account our local living wages and what we consider to be sort of a reasonable range for things. So and again, I'm happy to help somebody apply this if you want to be doing this, but basically our baseline minimum wage for a 40-hour-a-week job would be $20 an hour. So if something came in at all 1s across the board, we'd still be paying that person $20 an hour. There are no jobs within our organization that are going to be coming out with a score of 1. We have one job right now that's a short-term contract that is a little bit over a 1. And this is going to generate what exactly that wage should be. This is the part where I haven't presented on this much, so I feel a little clunky trying to explain this. But what it will generate for you is what the dollar per hour ought to be. And then this next column gives you the hours of the position. And so it tells you what the starting salary ought to be for that. And then there's a ratio check column here. So the ED, my role is the highest paid in the organization. So that's a 1. Because that is the baseline that it's being tagged off of. And then everything that we currently have hired ought to be no more than a 1.5. Right now we have one that's a 1.7. And so I am temporarily on hold with being able to get my salary raised up to the point that the matrix says that it should be until we have this salary raised up. So what the wage ratio does is it forces the top person in the organization to bring everybody else up in order to be making the salary that you want or need to be making or should be making. So the formulas do the ratio work for you. And again, I'd be happy to talk through with anybody who actually wants to use this, how the formulas are set up. I don't think we need to do that for the purposes here today. But when I'm talking about having a carefully crafted and applied wage setting matrix, this is what I'm talking about, is something like this. You can do a simpler version of it for your organization, but you want to have something that spits out even-handed levels of what each position ought to be making. So are there any questions about that? Okay, I'm seeing the chat numbers going up. What's going on in chat over here? Okay, cool, great, cool. Awesome. Okay, great. You'll have the link to the blank for this. You won't have North Coast Food Web's version of it, but you'll have the blank so that you can use this for your own organizations if you want to. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll back through. Okay. So then let's talk about raises for a minute and why I'm saying they should be non-negotiable, automatic, and accounting for cost of living rise. So the non-negotiable part is basically what I said earlier. Again, white men tend to be really good at coming in and saying, I want a really big raise and pushing on it to be able to get that. That's not fair. It shouldn't be about how well your parents taught you to advocate for yourself. It should really be about, people are doing good work for the organization. I'm just going to always assume that if someone isn't doing good work for the organization, they wouldn't still be here by the time it comes around for raises. So automatic means I just build it into our budget. It is automatic. Everybody on their work anniversary gets a raise. They all get the same raise. And I'll show you what that looks like in our budget calculations here in a second. And then it accounts for the cost of living rise. So what this looks like for us, so this is our policy, is 3% plus cost of living increase over the calendar year prior to the budget approval for the next year. Our budget gets approved in November. So on October 15th, I am going to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and I am looking at what the cost of living rise over the last year was. And what I am sticking into our budget documents, our budget spreadsheet for that year is this raise calculation. So in this year, that was an 11.2% raise because cost of living went up a shit ton the year before. It went up by over 8%. So CPI plus 3% generated this calculation number. This year, right now, if I was going to run it today, it would be less than that. It would be about a 7.5% raise for everybody. And so what that means is that budget that's passed in November is for, so for this year, it will be like, that will start on January 1st. We have a couple employees that started on January 5th. So their raise next year is going to be based on whatever that is. But then so is everybody else's over the course of the year. So it's a little bit, it's less than ideal in some ways, because what's affecting your raise could be almost 2 years old when you finally get around to that raise, but it's an attempt to actually keep up with that and to make sure that everyone's being treated the same way over the course of the year. So again, I realize that's clunky and kind of non-ideal, but that's the best that I've been able to come up with for how to do this. And I can show you in here. This also relates to the wage transparency thing. So this is that document that my staff is working in right now for developing budgets for next year. And so this is all laid out right there for everybody. So at the bottom of the staff page, there's this thing that is talking about what are current wages. We've got a couple more roles that are, getting shored up, and some changes that are being made within the organization. But on January 1st, I anticipate this is where we're going to be. And then after the raises for the year, that's what the numbers are going to be. And then this is the date for the raises. And this number correlates to a green box that is in each positions thing here. So our producer support manager started in November last year, so her raise will kick in November. So this is just literally built right into the spreadsheet that I'm asking the board to approve in November for our annual budget process. Okay. Okay, so that's stuff on wages. Let me pause there for a second and see, do folks want to talk about wages at all? Oh, okay, great. This is such a great question, Sheila. Okay, Sheila asked in the chat, we have a national organization with people living everywhere. So how do you weigh that? And what happens if someone moves to a more expensive place? Yeah, so this was actually the case with that worker co-op that I was telling you about earlier that I worked with. They had people in like 6 different states. The cost of living was radically different in different states. And what I would say is you need to come up with a policy for this. And that's got to be a policy that everybody understands, ideally has input into. What they ended up saying was, we're never going to lower somebody's salary when they move to a cheaper place, but it may put raises on hold for them until it's caught back up. So people don't get punished for moving to like a more rural area, but that they would bump it up if somebody moved to a more expensive place. And that was somewhat budget dependent, how quickly they could do that. Like if someone spontaneously decided to move from rural Missouri to San Francisco, that's going to be a big bump up for the budget that year. And so what they've got is that the organization has to catch up within 3 months with somebody's move date. And so they tried to figure out a way to sort of balance out, like, let's make sure we're not killing the budget and that everybody's not just suddenly going, hey, now I want to live in the big city. So it's a really good question. I don't know that that's the best answer, but that was what that particular organization decided to do with it. Right. Other questions about raises or wage related things? 2 individuals in the same job that live in 2 different areas. Yeah, so their wages would be different, but the only difference would be based on where they're living geographically. So it's tied to cost of living. It's tied to something that is justifiable and isn't about valuing that individual differently. It's just recognizing that they have different circumstances. I've also seen organizations take into account how many kids somebody has. They've voluntarily decided to, say that, if you're in a different place on this living wage calculator thing. Sorry, give me just a second. My cat is being really fucking annoying. Hang on just a second. Dude. To be clear, this is a cat with a cat door who just made me get up and let him in by being obnoxious for 5 minutes. This is probably terrible on my part. So let's see. Isn't what illegal, Karen? Can you go ahead and
sorry, trying to do too many things. Like isn't that discrimination if you're paying people different wages based on the number of kids that they have?
So I think that there may be some states where it is and some states where it isn't. I don't know the answer to that. And again, I said I'm not I'm not a lawyer, so I can't. So you can't take anything that I say as like legal advice, but I think you could ask for where you are and find out whether it's legal or not. So it's a good question. And just because one organization has done it doesn't mean everybody else has to do it. But yeah. How do we settle on 3% raise aside from COLA? Yeah, so 3% it's noticeable in somebody's paycheck, it's significant. And also is not so high that it's likely to be really hard on the organization. So, 3% was just the number that we came up with. I'm not necessarily for advocating that being the right number, Jen, but that was what we came up with.
There was a question up higher from Jack. Do you see any value to merit-based raises, or is maintaining employment considered the metric? And does that mean a high performance standard for employees?
So I don't really, I think that merit-based is a concept that I feel like has its roots in capitalism and white supremacy. And so I'm just going to say that I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about what I mean by that. But basically, I think if somebody has been with the organization for a year, they are contributing more. And so I consider merit to be, as you say, maintaining employment, I think is the metric for merit-based. When you get into merit-based arguments, I think that's where you end up with people who are more articulate and more willing to advocate for themselves, end up getting higher raises because, if you're smart enough, you can spin merit in all kinds of ways. And so I don't really, it's not that I don't see value in it. I totally get that some people are rock star employees and some people are, they're doing fine employees, but I think that there's other places to be, offering correction, offering support for people to get better at their jobs. I think there's other ways to do it. And I don't think making it easier for some people to live is the way that you should be doing that. So I don't know if that's helpful. What level of living wage do we use? So where we are at right now. So right now, our functional minimum wage for our organization is $25 an hour. And so you can see that's fine. If you are a childless single person, it's pretty close, if you're two adults working, if you've got two adults working with two kids. So we are meeting it in some places and not others. And so I'm interested in watching and having us increase our wages overall over time, because we're not yet there. So I just look at this and I go for many people's circumstances, we are paying living wages at this point. For some circumstances, we're not. And so I need to be keeping on that as the director and working on bringing everybody else up. How do you manage things so 29 for a development director when the going competitive wages? Well, I don't think that's the going competitive wage in Clatsop County, Oregon. We have not had an issue with people not applying for our jobs since we have gotten wages shored up to the level that we are right now. And development directors in particular, on average, stay for 16 months. So development director roles, I think, are a particularly sticky example here because the role sucks in so many ways in the nonprofit sector. I think you are going to have to deal with the reality that some people are not going to apply for the work. We also have a pretty robust benefits package, and that makes a lot of difference for people. So I think if it's just, wow, where is it $70 to $90 an hour that's the going competitive wage? Where is that, Sheila? So curious, other than San Francisco or New York City. Anyway, side note, we can talk about that later, but yeah, I think you do the best that you can with this stuff, but I do think that getting in the ballpark of living wages is probably, it's probably a goal that we should all be doing. And so we're working on it right now. We are in progress with that at North Coast Food Web. Okay, so let's talk about benefits, because this is another very big topic. So, common benefits, health, dental, and vision insurance. Often when we say benefits, what we mean is, can I go to the dentist and can I go to the doctor? That's really what people are often asking. But there's a lot of different things that could go into benefits. And so we've just started this year doing a budget benefit survey. And so I asked my employees for everybody to fill this out. And so which of these additional benefits would be most valuable for me personally? So so our baseline right now is here. So I said, assume that we still have our current benefits package. So we have 100% paid employer health insurance. We have flex time and work from home options that make sense for everybody. We've got a pretty robust paid time off policy that equates to 5 weeks a year between sick time and vacation time and holidays. We commit $750 a year. It's going up to $800 next year for professional development. So that's our current package. And then, so I asked folks, what do you want of, which of these additional things would be most beneficial for you? What's your top 2 priorities? Is there anything that you didn't check for you personally, but you want to advocate for your teammates? So this is part of me trying to create a culture where we care about each other. And it's not just what's going to be, you've already told me what's most important for you, but like we have people on staff who don't have kids and people who do have kids. And so almost everybody who didn't have kids said, like, I would love to see a dependent care allowance for the people who do. So they were, stretching to be supportive of the other people on staff. And then I asked the question from a justice or equity standpoint, what do you think the highest priorities ought to be? And so we're trying to think about it from a lot of different angles. I think it's important to ask people what's actually going to be beneficial to them when you're in a leadership role, rather than making assumptions about that. And so the first thing I want to say about benefits is, like, ask your people what they need and want as you're doing this. And then, figure out, whoops, sorry, there we go. Yeah, the one thing that was new for me, and it's kind of weird that I had never bumped into this before, but we're looking this year at adding a flexible spending account. Are people familiar with what those are? Basically, it's a chunk of money that comes out of people's paychecks tax-free, and then they can spend it on additional medical things. So which can take a lot of different varieties and are often things that traditional insurance doesn't cover. So flexible spending accounts are cool. Check them out. For people who have regular, like I have a medical condition that my health insurance is completely useless for, that I spend $300 to $500 a month on, and being able to have the money that I'm spending on that be tax-free is going to make a really big difference in my life next year. And it's still my money that I've earned. Like, the organization doesn't have to put any money on the table for this, but it's a really nice benefit. And, so looking for those things that don't actually cost the organization much or anything, but are actually really helpful for your employees is one of the things that we can, that you can look at doing. Okay. Okay, so another question that I think is really important is, who gets access to benefits? So oftentimes part-time people, which could include even people that are working as much as 30 hours a week, are not considered benefits eligible. I would really look at that. We had, at my last job, our insurance provider wouldn't let us cover anybody who was working less than 20 hours a week. That's a shitty policy on their part. So we, like in our case, like basically anybody, I think that our current insurance provider lets us start at 15 hours a week. And so that's where we start benefits, is at 15 hours a week. So the core question here is, are you structuring things to dodge employee care or to codify it? I worked for a food co-op for a while in Laramie, Wyoming, who had everybody's shifts were 7.5 hours. because they didn't have to legally give you more than a 15-minute break if you weren't working 8 hours a week. So they structured things to dodge employee care instead of codifying it. And so really thinking through things about like your hours structures, your benefit structures, so that it's really about taking care of people rather than not taking care of people and like squeezing the most out of them. And that's often what ends up happening with the ways that some employers do stuff. So I just want to encourage folks to not do that kind of thing. So dodging or codifying, two really different ways of structuring things. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about paid time off. And so PTO, as it often gets shortened to. So this is that combination of vacation time, sick time, and holiday time where people are actually, where people are paid for it. And you can do that with people who are either paid hourly or salaried. So if it's salaried, you're taking that wage, that wage amount that your matrix is spitting out, and are you multiplying that by X number of hours times 52 hours a week, or by the amount of weeks that person would actually be expected to be paid? Did that make sense? I'm not sure that made sense. If you're multiplying it by 52 hours a week, then you're actually building in paid time off into somebody's salary. Is that cool? Okay, I'm seeing nods from the couple of people who said I can see. Great. Second time I said that a little more clearly. Yeah, great. Okay, cool. Yeah, so paid time off, I think sometimes we make assumptions about everybody sort of being the same, and there's not one size fits all. It's actually much more equitable to be structuring things as flexibly as possible. So we put everything into one bucket. We have a PTO bucket. We don't have a sick time bucket. Sometimes groups are like, you can have 2 weeks of vacation and a week of sick time. And it's like, well, so if somebody doesn't get sick at all, they don't get to take those extra days off to help them do self-care? Or what if somebody is sick more than that? Do they not get to take that time off? And so putting it all into one bucket and saying, spend it however you want to spend it. And also disconnecting it from national holidays. Not everybody's meaningful holidays are the same. And so like, I don't actually give a shit about some of the more patriotic holidays. Like, I don't care. I worked on the 4th of July because I literally don't care about that holiday at all. And it was great to be in a nice, quiet office where the phone wasn't ringing and no one expected anything from me. I'm like, that was fabulous. So, and then there's going to be some things like, I used to take solstices off because those were my holidays and they're not national holidays. And so I would want those days off, but I would end up spending vacation time to take my holidays off. So not everyone's meaningful holidays are the same. Consider disconnecting office and program closures from days off. Now, obviously, if you run a program where you've got to be interfacing with people, like you're going to have less flexibility with this, but like we only have 1 day a week where we have an active program where we absolutely have to have people in the office. And so we can totally disconnect that. So we can have the office closed on days when, and then people can work or not work if they want to, and they just report their PTO at the end of each pay period. Explicitly naming mental health days as legit. So I say to people when they come in, like, you can use sick time either for physical or mental health stuff. If you are just like, I cannot do adulting today, fucking stay home. That is totally fine. Call in sick. You don't have to justify it. So just recognizing that people are going to use their PTO for really different things. Sometimes some people need family time. Some people need more mental health days. Some people are going to save up and take 2 solid weeks off. Other people are going to like take 3-day weekends pretty regularly. And that's what health maintenance looks like for them. And so really having it be structured in a way that lets people do what works for them. This is a big one and one that's kind of a legacy one. Like there's a lot of organizations that still require doctor's notes to be able to take a sick day. This is garbage practice on so many levels. Like not everybody can afford to go to the doctor. Even if you have health insurance, you can't necessarily afford to go. So basically, like, don't make it about any other authority other than the employee themselves for when they take time off. That does not mean that you can't approve or disapprove vacation requests. So we had a fun little convergence that happened where I had 3 new hires between like January and March this year, and all 3 of them had family vacation already scheduled during the same week. So half of my staff was suddenly gone simultaneously, and both that week and the week after, when everybody was playing catch up, were kind of rough. And so it is okay. And I was basically like, I'm not going to say no to anybody's vacations that you've already got scheduled, but let's never do this again. So it's still okay to be managing people's time off. Yeah, it's still, I don't mean to imply that you don't get to manage that in a way that works for the organization. So I also really like the policy of requiring minimum use of PTO. I've had a couple times where I've had employees who were like, they just would never take time off unless I made them. And then they would burn out and they'd really be struggling, and they'd be like, oh, I feel really unproductive right now, or I just feel like I'm tired. I'll tell you, it's like, because you haven't taken a vacation day, and how long? We all need to detox from internalized capitalism. That's the way that I think about it. We're living in a time where there's a ton of pressure on people to be productive nonstop. And I want us to try to unplug that. And so requiring minimum use of PTO, if you have, like in our case, it's about 5 weeks total time. Like, I want people to be taking at least a solid week off at some point. And fortunately, my crew right now is pretty good about that. So I haven't had to like get weird about it, but get weird about it if it means that people are not very good about taking care of themselves. Cross-training is really essential, so that everybody can actually take time off. We have one program manager who has really struggled with being able to take time off. And so we're really trying to make sure that she's getting enough. Other people know basic functions of her job so that if she does end up being sick on a Thursday when the market is happening, that's okay. The world isn't going to fall apart. Things are going to be fine. But you need to put some pre-thought into cross-training what those things are in order to ensure that everybody actually can take time off. Okay, and then I already talked about that. Wow, it's already almost 11. I'm sorry, this is longer than I thought it was going to be. I thought we'd have more time to talk. Okay, I'm going to try to like get through the rest of this pretty quickly.
You answered a lot of questions. I wouldn't worry.
Okay, good, great. Okay. Okay, so just a few other policy things, allowing as much work from home as you can stand and as much flex time and individually determined scheduling as you can stand. In our case, we have 2 days a week where one of our employees absolutely has to be there. And then we have our staff meeting day where I'm like, I really want people to be there on staff meeting day. Other than that, people can have lots of flexibility about how much they work from home. So, if one of our parents needs to like work from home because one of the kids is sick, they absolutely get to do that. Almost everybody has 1 day a week where they typically work from home because they've got that flexibility. So let people set things up. Obviously don't compromise your programs, but it makes a really big difference in terms of people's quality of life to be able to have some control over that. Make sure that people are taking care of themselves. That may mean sometimes you have to assert with people, I don't see you taking breaks or downtime during the day. You're like legally like entitled to breaks. And so I've only had to do that once in my current job, and it corrected over time. So it doesn't mean you have to be uptight about it, but just recognize people are legally entitled to downtime during the day. So also don't dictate irrelevant things, dress codes, whether people are sitting down or standing up, all this kind of stuff is just like, it's not important. It doesn't actually impact how well people are doing their jobs. We've heard some horror stories about employers that never let their, like you get one bathroom break during the day, like that is inhumane. So just like be a little bit mindful about what you're actually monitoring and trying to control. And does it really matter? And then this is a whole other topic. I'm going to toss it in here because it's one thing we've been talking about within OCFSN recently, is having health and safety plans. So I'm also not an expert on these. I am just learning about this kind of stuff, but This is another thing, like if there's any way that your work environment is unhealthy for people, you should be obligated to be correcting for that. Okay, 40-hour work week. So I'm just going to call bullshit on like this whole thing about like hard work as a virtue. Again, I think that's internalized capitalism speaking. Reality is that on average, most of us are only really productive for 3 hours a day. That's it, of actual genuine productivity. So starting to think about 4 or even 3-day work weeks, shorter days, flexible start and end times, all of that stuff there's like science backing for the fact that you don't actually lose that much when you reduce the amount of hours that people are required to be putting in. Part of the shift can be like, I don't actually, like we have a ballpark estimate on how long this job ought to take to do well. And I don't care if you're working that number of hours anyway, I care that you're getting the things done. Also recognize that people are going to use different tools to get through their day. Some people take longer lunch breaks. They take a dedicated lunch break. They don't eat at their desk. I have ADHD and I'm terrible. I eat at my desk. I don't take formal breaks. But what I do is I have a computer, I have a game on my phone that multiple times a day, I spend 5 to 10 minutes playing because my brain is about to short out. That is my tactic for how I stay productive for the rest of that time. That should be totally fine. That is not bad behavior. That's not an employee cheating you out of something. It is somebody who has figured out what they need to do in order to do their best work for your organization. So there's a whole big thing to unpack here. I'm just going to toss it out there as like food for thought for you, but really thinking about like, how do people manage to be as productive as possible and also not expecting people to be productive all of the time. I sometimes have people get ashamed that they're like, I'm just having a really unproductive day. And I'm like, you're a mammal. Like mammals are not constantly productive. It is totally fine for you to still be here, not taking PTO and having a semi-productive day. That is okay to have sometimes because that is just natural, and not creating shame around that is a really good thing.
On that, we have a question from Abigail. Are those living wages set at working 40 hours a week?
Yes, that is what they are based on, is the 40-hour work week. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about hiring practices. So number one is, so I went to this very dry and boring presentation in January about updated employment law. And one of the really interesting things that just happened is that the state of Washington put a state law through that says that you must disclose salary and benefits on all job postings. And that applies to any job that anyone who might eventually get that job might apply for, no matter what state they live in. So functionally, Washington State did this really clever thing and has kind of forced the entire country to start disclosing salary and benefits. It's just a good idea anyway. I mean, it sucks to like apply for a job and then find out that it doesn't pay enough to be able to live on. So it's a really good equity practice in general. It saves everybody a lot of time to do that. And it is actually now a legal requirement. The other thing is that I really encourage organizations to tell what the salary is going to be and not post salary ranges. Used to be that the thinking was that this was a good thing because it gave an opportunity for like, you could hire somebody with a little less skill and pay them a little less. And then if somebody's more skilled, but you know what, like the job is worth what the job is worth. And that opens the door. That is how a lot of those long-term wage biases ended up getting built into the system. You also can't make postings that blatantly discriminate against a protected class. So there used to be like, we're seeking women for X role, or we're seeking recent college graduates. That's the modern version of this that is often in there. That is discriminatory. That discourages people over a certain age from applying for your job. So you can't use language like that in job postings. You can't ask application questions that push someone to disclose membership in a protected class. Okay, so you can't ask about somebody's race or gender or marital status. All those things are protected classes. I'll throw up here in a second a little more about that. Also, cover letters are a trap. Okay, it is a very standard practice to say, submit your resume and cover letter. Cover letters basically say, read my mind for what I want to know about you. So unless mind reading is actually part of the job, don't use cover letters. Ask a few specific questions. And I tell people, don't, unless the job is one where they're going to have to be doing professional writing regularly, I'm like, don't worry about formatting this as a cover letter. I don't need you to do that. That's not a job skill you're going to be using every day. So I'm like, here's my 3 or 4 questions. Answer these questions and submit your resume. And then finally, I think it's a really good practice to the best of your ability, accurately disclose the state of equity work within your organization in either the posting or the interviews. We are in early stages of working on X, Y, and Z. We have these equity policies in place right now. This gives people an opportunity to decide whether you are a safe and healthy organization for them to be a part of without them having to disclose that they're part of one of these protected classes. And it's also just a good humility practice because nobody is 100% there on this equity stuff. Okay, so is colorblind hiring even a thing? I love this question. We're all like, we're trying to be colorblind in our hiring. I'm like, no, it isn't a thing. Like, you aren't actually colorblind. Nobody doesn't see somebody's race when they walk into your office, and obviously there are folks who pass. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like us trying to pretend somebody walks in, they're clearly African-American. You pretend that you don't see that they're Black and you're supposed to somehow ignore that. I don't think it's actually the goal. I mean, I think the goal is actually to see the people in front of us accurately. And then, to ask curious questions within legal bounds about how all of the person's experience would potentially benefit them. So us spending a bunch of energy during an interview trying to unsee something really important about a person is actually not good hiring discernment, and it's not a good equity practice. Let me say a little bit more about that because there's legal things here. So it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. Here's some very specific language, official language, about what those protected classes are, that you can't, that there's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission enforces federal laws prohibiting discrimination during any phase of the hiring process. And you can't include any questions, again, that will produce a response that would indicate an applicant's protected class. So you can't ask directly about race. You can't ask questions that are veiled versions of that. And so here's the thing, if we really want to be doing equity work, it's important for us to be able to talk about what equity means with real humans. So, oh, wait, one more slide. So these are the things you can't do. You can't ask a direct question. You can't post jobs in a way, as I said before, that indicate what type of person you're looking for. And you can't hire or not hire someone because they're of a particular race. Now, what you can do is take into account relevant lived experience. So if you are hiring for a position, for instance, that works with a particular community, it is totally fine to ask about what their experience is with that particular community. That is directly relevant to the job. Okay. So here's some examples of questions that are probably fine. And I'm saying probably again, because I'm not an employment lawyer. There could be cases where you may get in trouble for phrasing something like this, but what experience do you have working with a population? What lived experience do you have in racially diverse communities? What would qualify you to work with X community? Do you speak Spanish? We have an explicit goal about becoming more diverse, but we're in the process with that. Have you worked in that context before? So here's a question that I have asked that probably is a little more on the line. So I'm not advocating you do this or not, but I'm just going to say I have done this. When somebody has disclosed already that they are a person of color, I have asked, how do you feel about working in a predominantly white organization? And what would you need to have that be okay? That one might be sketchy. I maybe shouldn't be asking that question, but what I'm signaling to the applicant is, hey, I see you, and it is okay for you to show up as your whole person with me as your potential boss. And I want us to be able to have conversations about equity. So that's what I'm trying to signal with that. But again, I may be sketchy close to the line with that one. Okay, so one more quick piece on, actually, I'm not going to read this. I'm not going to go through this because it's fairly self-explanatory and you're going to get the slides. I do want to say one more thing, which is that unions are a good thing. So unions are there to protect people from bad practices on the part of employers. And there is actually a nonprofit workers union. One of the things that I am starting to talk to my staff about how I would really support them unionizing. I can't do that because I'm the manager. I am management. So I won't be able to join that union. But what I want to do is I want to have put into place a whole bunch of really good practices for worker care. And I want to make sure that the next ED isn't going to be able to take it all away. And so part of that is that, encouraging our folks to unionize. So I'm very pro-union. I think I'm obviously very pro-worker, which means I'm pro-union. So I encourage this. I think the other thing is that worker cooperatives are a really good thing. They kind of, drop out that separation between managers and workers in some really functional and beautiful ways when they are functional. So unionization is good. Worker co-ops are good. But if you're a nonprofit already, you probably aren't going to be able to convince your board to stop being a board and have you become a worker on co-op. Although I've seen it happen a couple times. Anyway, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. It was 11:11. Okay, we have 4 minutes. I'm sorry. That was a lot. Oh, hi.
That was amazing. Fantastic.
Okay.
I just learned a ton.
Mm.
Yeah. Folks have questions?
I do. I'm in the process of trying to convert staff or contractors to staff. And despite having apparently fundraised enough for the next 2 years to support hiring at wages more similar and employee policies more similar to what you just described, my board is scared of making commitments that we can't carry on long term. What rationale do you have? How do you justify being able to maintain these wages over time?
Yeah. So, yeah, and working with boards is always interesting with this because so you as the ED, you should have the authority to set wages. That is part of what the ED is supposed to have. That is not really the board's job to do that. And they can express concern about it. But what I would do actually, Jen, is I would go and find the stats on turnover in the nonprofit sector, and similarly find the stats about how much it costs on average an organization in lost money of other ways when you lose people. And those two stats together add up to a pretty potent argument for we need to be maintaining the good staff that we currently have. And I'd also frankly make a human rights argument. It's if our people are not being able to live on the wages and they don't have access to health insurance, that's us falling down on the job as humans for our other people. So those would be the ways that I would approach it. And I'd also say, nonprofit finances are always a little volatile. And man, if you've got wrapped up 2 years of financing, man, you're doing amazing. That's an incredible thing. And that is a rare thing in the nonprofit sector. And we all want stability. I think that you could make a commitment to seeking out multi-year funding for staffing positions. There are some foundations that are totally down with that. They get why. Collins Foundation is one of them, Murdoch Foundation. They get why multi-year is really important. And so I would say yep, and my commitment, I want you to give me this so that I can take care of our people. And in exchange for that, we are going to commit to looking specifically for multi-year funding so that things are evened out over time. So that's how I would approach it.
Thank you.
Mhm. Oh, I just noticed Andy is on here. I was super curious. So one of my staffers is on here and I'm super curious now about how you responded to all that. Hi, Andy. Which you don't have to answer right now, but.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on utilizing AmeriCorps programs and how that fits into this conversation.
Yeah, so AmeriCorps is basically very low paid internships. Is that what it is? Yeah, so I have some very judgy opinions about that. I think that nonprofits do it because they need to do it to survive and to keep their programs going. And it is tricky though, because the people that I know who have done AmeriCorps, the AmeriCorps higher ups have also automatically sent them a bunch of information about how to like access things like SNAP benefits because they know perfectly well that they do not pay anything close to living wages. So yeah, so I don't know what to do with that. I mean, I'm very against, unpaid internships are terrible. I mean, they basically only work for like people with lots of financial privilege, but AmeriCorps is kind of like a half a step better than that. So I don't know. How are you feeling about it? I mean, you're obviously bringing it up. So yeah.
Well, I served as an AmeriCorps member for 2 years, and it did help me get to the place where I am with my career and food systems position.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this understanding that you're put into a community as a low income individual and like a full, like that is a part of the experience. So, but
Yeah.
it's very hard to like, I feel like, maybe nonprofits should kind of shift from going away from that, but it is like this opportunity. So I also have feelings about it.
Are you prevented at all from doing other things for them? Like, could you offer them health benefits? Like, are there ways that you could mitigate some of that? I don't actually know the ins and outs of AmeriCorps very well, but that's what I'd be trying to figure out.
They do have health benefits.
But they do.
Yeah, I also started as an AmeriCorps in the nonprofit sector, and I think it often depends on the organization. Some would kind of treat you as an intern and give you, relative responsibilities. I was treated like a full staff member. And which is completely exploitative, was making like $5 an hour. So there's that level too. And there are benefits outside of the SNAP benefits that they offer. Like healthcare is part of it. I got my teeth worked on when I had that.
That's big, being able to get your teeth worked on, which is unfortunate that that's big. I mean, can I also just make a plug for like, if your organization can show up in support of like better wage laws, which in Oregon compared to like other states are pretty, they're pretty good and they're still not living wages, and also like just like advocacy around Medicare for all and just like how absolute game changing that would be for the entire nonprofit sector if we weren't having to come up with like thousands of dollars a year to like be doing that from our budgets instead of from somewhere else. So yeah, I guess what I'll say, Abigail, is I think it's a really good question. And I understand the realities of organizations and I know that you might have to go there, but just like, what can you do to put some context around it to, support people better?
Thanks.
I think we're at time. I feel like folks, if they need to jump off, don't hesitate. Are there any other questions just in case? So this is a really great topic, and these slides will be available. Thanks, Yana, and we'll have this recording so you can share this with your networks and boards and these things, because I'm super excited to share this with the leadership team at OCFSN and things like that. So
right. I just dropped the link to the slides into the chat, and then Andrew, can you also send it to everybody after? Because I don't
Sure.
have everyone's contact info.
Yeah.
Great. And my email is Yana at northcoastfoodweb.org. Just type that right. There you go. Feel free to reach out. Yeah, the spreadsheets that I showed are linked in through the presentation, the slides. Yeah, go ahead. Somebody else was
I
starting
have
a
a
question.
question for you, Yana. This is
Hey, Laura.
Laura. So sometimes when we're writing grants around this stuff, especially federal grants, there's contractors involved. And how do you reconcile $125 an hour, $85 an hour, $65 an hour rates in the context of your wage planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another thing that you ought to think through if you're going to do a wage ratio about like who does it apply to, and are there exceptions to it? So yeah, I mean, I feel, oh, Laura, I have a lot of different thoughts about that, and they don't all flow in the same direction. I mean, I do think that there are times where hiring a consultant who charges $125 an hour is going to just be a really smart move organizationally. And so I do think that that there's times where you have to do that and where you will end up like violating the wage ratio in that process. I do think that it could be an interesting thing to talk to potential folks that you might hire as consultants, say like, hey, so we have this policy, how do you feel about that? And would you be willing to have your consultant rate be capped at the top of our wage ratio on that? And or if not, I mean, it might be interesting screening for like who actually is thinking about equity issues, or who at least gets like, oh, I totally get why you do that, that's cool. That might be somebody I'd feel more excited about working with, even if I still end up having to pay them $100 an hour. So I don't know. That's a great question. It's Jack.
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little about your personal experience implementing policies like this. Like, how much of an uphill battle was it for you? And like, was it personally challenging? Like, we're in this process of expanding as an organization, and I'm trying to like maintain our values and character as we grow, and we're working with some consultants, and we're bringing in some staff that have like different corporate experiences, and I'm feeling all this pushback for things that I thought were what we were doing and who we are. So I'm just curious about your experiences, and if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say it's been all over the map. My current organization has been really supportive. Like I've had a really great round of board support from this current group. At my last job, that wasn't the case, and the wage ratio conversation literally never went anywhere. And so I just acted as if, because they weren't actually in there with me doing the hiring decisions. And so I ended up sort of doing an end run a little bit around my board that time, which did not feel great. I do think if you have a strategic plan and it names equity stuff in it at all, I would just keep tying it back in and going like, hey, this is actually what equity means. This is actually what justice means. Whatever the language is in your strategic plan, I would pull on that as much as possible for this. And then, once you get it codified, like we have an employee handbook, and a lot of this stuff is codified in the handbook at this point. And once it's in there, then it's like, nope, we're not arguing about this and we're not talking about it. It's like, this is who we are. This is what we do. But getting that through, if you have a couple board members who you trust and who you feel like get it, I would maybe ask them if they'd be willing to help you put together a revision to the employee handbook that has some of the stuff baked into it. And once it's in that document and the board has approved that document, then it gets a lot easier. So look for your internal allies around this. And I'd also I wouldn't hire consultants who aren't willing to be part of this conversation at this point. Like they're not really helping, And I think for employees that have come out of more corporate stuff, I mean, they may actually really get it about the paying higher wages part and benefits. Like if they're coming out of that, they might really understand why some of those things are important. But you can also have a conversation about them about like, hey, we're trying to do things differently here, and this is why. Always going back to that why. And again, those stats on employee turnover and costs of replacing employees can be really helpful. If you got somebody super business minded, man, pull those stats out. They're really helpful.
Thank you.
I'm curious if you could go back a little bit to, you talked about doing a survey for your staff. And we've done something similarly of having some various conversations about what benefits and being pretty creative with some of our benefits that we offer. And so wondering kind of about that balance. We have a really small organization. So what people are wanting right now in this moment might be very different from what people want, in the future. So as we're putting these policies into place, how do you kind of balance like what the immediate needs of the individuals you have at the moment are versus kind of these longer term policies that you're creating?
Yeah, I think the top priority is who the humans are right now, who are in the mix. I mean, I think that should be, that should be the core thing. And if it changes over time, that's okay. And that's part of why having like an annual survey is really helpful, because it could be that the needs of next year's staff, whether they're the same people or not, could actually be pretty different. So I think regularly asking the question and doing it in the context of budget development, I think is important. And so, we had, that survey generated, a whole bunch of stuff that could be really helpful for people. And then we had a collective conversation. We said, okay, so I think the budget can probably stretch by X amount next year. I think we can fit a few of these things. And so let's talk about, if we can only have a few of these, what do we actually want those things to be? But we were able to, everybody had already sort of put on the table what their top priorities were. And, I don't know if the budget that I'm putting together right now, if all of it is going to fly. I have a board meeting next week where I'm going to say, like, here's what we're proposing. I want to get board buy-in right now for building these things into the budget. And so we're giving the board the background on it. We did a survey. Here's what our current benefits are. Here's why these are important. And yeah, but like next year we might be coming back and saying, yeah, that FSA thing, like that actually wasn't that useful. Let's try to do something different this year. And that's okay. I think setting the precedent that we're going to keep asking the question is probably the main thing with that, and then do as much as your budget can support. We also got some really good guidance from, so we're working with Blackbird Benefits Collective. And put that in here. And they're really good. And they actually pointed me at a couple of things that we hadn't thought of. Like accident insurance is like $15 a month per person. And it's a supplement to a standard health insurance policy that, like, literally if you get in an accident, they just hand you cash to cover the things that your insurance policy doesn't cover. It's amazing. And it's $15 a month. And I would never have known that if I wasn't working with a benefits provider or benefits broker, I think is the word, who has an equity lens. And that's what Blackbird is. Like, they've got an equity lens built into what they're doing. So they've been super helpful. So I would recommend working with them. And you'll be like the fourth or fifth organization in OCFSM that's working with them. Like, a bunch of us are sort of switching over to working with them this year. But they've been super helpful to, like, what's the low cost thing that's actually going to be like the most impactful for our employees. They're great on that front. So I don't know, did I actually answer your question, Rebecca? Okay. Cool. All right. Anything else?
Amazing. Thanks,
Okay.
Yana.
Cool. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity to geek out about this stuff for an hour and a half with you. I appreciate it. Yeah.
So helpful. And now it's you can direct people to this when they bother or asking you for help on this. You can say, like, hey, I did a whole really in-depth presentation on this. Here's the link.
Here's the recording.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's giving yourself
Yeah.
capacity too. Thanks,
This was
everybody.
incredible. Thank you so much, Yana.
You're welcome. You're
Talk to
welcome. Good
you
luck with
soon.
it all, everybody. All right, bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.